So let's work a little bit together with this text. It's chunky, it's crunchy. I once had a student refer to a difficult text as a horse smoothie. And I think this one qualifies as a horse smoothie. So I want to work with you on this. They're starting out here and they're introducing first Romanesque, these buildings that were the beginnings of this Romanesque style of architecture. Soon after the year 1000, patrons and builders in Catalonia, northeast Spain, southern France, and northern Italy were already constructing all masonry churches, employing the methods of late Roman builders. So take note, patrons are the people who have the money to pay for an artwork. This is an important part of the story of art history. What artists do is not just what artists want to do, it's what patrons want artists to do. So they're asking you to think, who are the patrons of these buildings? We'll talk about that. They're all masonry, entirely of stone, right? And so they're pointing out first this monastery. Can I be very French and say Saint-Martin-du-Canigou? It's in the Pyrenees mountain range that is kind of a border between France and Spain. But let's skip ahead. Oh, well, there is one thing I wanted to say here. Look who is the patron. Patronized by the local Count Guifred, who took refuge in the monastery and died here in 1049. These churches are related to noble class people with lots of money, ruling class people. And this is a monastery, but we should note that the monasteries were generally populated in terms of who's a monk, who's a nun, by people from wealthy families. It wasn't the peasants weren't going into monasteries. You will see this when we look at the video that culminates this module. It's a monk would likely be someone from a well-off noble family who is the second son, because the first son is going to inherit everything. So the second son needs something to do and somewhere to go. So the monasteries are related, yes, to religion, but also to social class and the ways that the noble class were spending their money and ensuring their wealth. We come down here to the Church of Saint Vincent in Cardona. This is another fine example of first Romanesque, so the early style of the Romanesque architecture. And this is in Catalan, Spain, related to a castle. So these castles were built around 1000 by noble families, really to impress, to intimidate, and to glorify themselves. So it was begun in the 1020s, this church, this stone masonry church. It was consecrated in 1040, which means it's ready to have its ceremony where it becomes sacred in 1040. So it took 20 years to build. And that's not surprising because look at the materials. If we come here, the Catalan masons used local materials, small split stones, bricks, river pebbles, and very strong mortar to raise plain walls and round barrel or groin vaults. They're saying plain walls because later more decoration is going to be added to the walls. And that's one of the reasons this is first Romanesque. It's relatively simple. But think about laying stone by stone by stone with the mortar, the sticky glue, holding those stones together to build up this very tall wall that becomes a curving ceiling. It's really incredibly laborious, right? So part of the way that power and privilege were expressed by these nobles was to be able to command teams of laborers to do this hard work. This is a little confusing here. The sanctuary was raised dramatically over an aisled crypt. What they mean is the sanctuary is this space. The sanctuary is the space in the apse where the sacred ceremonies take place. And this one has these steps. It's lifted because there's a crypt, a burial chamber underneath. So we're going to see in many of these churches that there are sacred relics, sacred remains of holy figures that are connected to the altars and that are part of what gives the church its spiritual power. So going back to architecture, they say we can admire their skillful stonework, both inside and out, but the builders originally covered their masonry with stucco. So in other words, this would have been smoothed over with a stucco skin. Come down here. This is where it gets to be a horse smoothie. To strengthen the exterior walls and enrich their sculptural presence, the masons added vertical bands of projecting masonry called strip buttresses, joined by arches and additional courses of masonry to counter the weight and outward thrust of the vault. Okay, slow down. They should have broken that up into smaller chunks. Chunk 1, a strip buttress. So a buttress is a support. It's an added reinforcing layer. And this reinforcing layer is just an extra strip of stone that is here vertically to help reinforce the wall. When they go on to say that the strip buttresses are joined by arches and additional courses, layers of masonry to counter the weight and outward thrust of the vault, they mean that the architects are adding, the architects are adding layers, see the extra layers, to create more reinforcement. So the textbook authors are telling you that all of those extra layers are being added to counter the weight and outward thrust of the vault. Let me help you see that. If we go back to this diagram of how Romans and then peoples after them created arches. So the arch and the pier are depicted here. Look at the arrows. The arrows are showing you the thrust, which means they're showing you the direction that the weight of these walls bearing down on the arch would make it push out that way, out that way, out that way, and that way. So what's happening is these stonemason architects have to think about how to push back against the thrust so that there's not, the wall doesn't just, kind of explode and the whole thing falls down. There has to be a counter thrust, and they want the thrust to go down into the ground and be supported and counterbalanced by all of the other stones and their weight. So then, on a related point, on the interior, these masonry strips, these strips of extra reinforcing stone, project from the piers and continue up and over the vault, creating a series of transverse arches. So look back at the picture. Here's those extra strips of stone, and what they're saying is, look, they continue to pile them up as reinforcing buttresses all the way up, and then they keep going along the vault, the curved ceiling, like a rib, a support. Okay, so they're talking to you about what they're having to do in order to make sure this building doesn't fall down, being made out of such heavy stones. And they go on to say that they're doing all of this for engineering purpose, but look at how there's a kind of a sculptural quality to the walls. There's sort of layers, there's straight elements and curved elements that gives a sculptural quality to the whole building. And that's important because what's going to happen is the idea of these buildings as architecture that is also sculptural will develop into something amazing.